Hello, I'm Jenny Graves from Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm an evolutionary geneticist and I work on animal genomes and sex determination. Today, I wanted to tell you about the new genetic differences between men and women. A lot of new data that we have that I think has real implications for our understanding of the differences between men and women and how we can transcend these differences to go to gender equity. So I'll talk about the differences in genes, the differences in gene action, and what this means for the physiology and diseases of men and women, and then why these gene differences have evolved, and then how we might think of transcending them. So I'm sure you all know that men and women differ in their chromosomes. Females, all mammal females, including women, have 2 copies of an X chromosome, and males have a single X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Now, the X chromosome is a big chromosome, has lots of genes, about 1,000 genes that do all sorts of different things. The Y chromosome is a really pathetic little chromosome. It has very few genes on it, just 27 genes, and a lot of what we call junk DNA. But it has a really important gene on it called SRY. And the SRY gene is the one that makes a baby a boy. So what SRY does is it kickstarts other genes to make a testis in the embryo. And the embryonic testis makes male hormones, and it's those hormones that make the baby a boy. In the absence of SRY, other genes kick in to make an ovary. The ovary and the body makes female hormones now, and that makes the baby a girl. So that's just one gene. But there are other genes on the Y chromosome. There's 26 other genes on the Y, and mostly they have a function in making sperm. So they don't really impact on the difference between males and females except for reproductive differences. Well, what about females? Females have 2 X chromosomes and males have only 1. And clearly that's not fair. So there's a mechanism that inactivates 1 X chromosome. So we always believe that men and women have the same number of X chromosomes. But that's really not true. There are at least 200 genes that are active on the inactive X. So there's 2 copies of these genes in women and only 1 copy in men. And we think that's really important because we now have a lot of evidence. The number of X chromosomes really affects a lot of very basic metabolic functions, like, for instance, the metabolism of fats and sugars and diabetes. Now, SRY is just 1 gene, but it controls many other genes. So there's SRY. SRY turns on other genes in the pathway to making a testis. And if there's no SRY, there are other genes that are turned off. So SRY is directly or indirectly controlling at least 60 other genes. So when we look at the genetic differences between men and women, we can see that there's 27 genes on the Y chromosome that are male specific, but there's also 60 genes in the pathway to making a testis that are male specific. Whereas females have 200 X genes that are different in dosage. But that's only the start of it, because some of these genes turn on hormones. So for instance, these pathway genes in males turn on male hormones, which are called androgens, and these go all over the body and turn on many, many other genes and turn off genes. At least some thousands of genes are turned on or off by androgens. And in females, the estrogens produced by a female body again turn on or off at least several thousand genes turned on. So when you look at the genetic differences, the differences in the actual genes, but more importantly, the differences in the activity of genes, it turns out that about 1/3 of our genes are expressed differently in one tissue or another. So 6,000, more than 6,000 genes, and we've only got 20,000, are expressed differently in one tissue or another. Well, that's not all of it. Even some genes which are turned on in both men and women are regulated differently. So let's say here's a gene that's active in, say, a kidney or something in both men and women, and you think it's doing the same job, but it's turned on in males, it's turned on by a male factor, and in females, it's turned on by a female factor. So these differences are actually very deep and very profound. If we look at what these genes are all doing, not surprisingly, many of them are differentially expressed in reproductive tissues. And in fact, the breast is the most different of all. There are thousands of genes that are overexpressed in female breasts. But the testis and prostate, again, there are hundreds of genes that are overexpressed in the male. So that's not too surprising. What is surprising is that there are lots of non-reproductive tissues, ordinary things like kidneys and livers, that are also have many genes that are expressed differently in men and women. So, for instance, in skin and muscle, there are hundreds of genes that are differentially expressed. And the heart, there's hundreds of genes. And most surprisingly of all, in the brain, in different regions of the brain, there can be tens or even hundreds of genes that are differentially expressed. And surprisingly, that includes good old SRY, the male determining gene, is expressed in the brain, and we think it has some function in the brain. So if you think, well, why are these genes differentially expressed in a kidney? Isn't a kidney just a kidney doing what kidneys do in both men and women? Obviously, the kidney is quite sexualized, as is the liver and the brain. Well, many of the traits that we're interested in, size and weight and brain function and so forth, are very complex traits, and they're determined by many genes, the interaction of very many genes, some giving you more, some giving you less. So there'll be a very wide distribution of this trait in the population. But all of these genes are very much influenced by the environment, and that includes the cultural environment. And it's quite possible that some of these environmental factors are sex-specific. So, for instance, if you take something really simple that everybody knows about, like height. So this is a distribution of adult females and males in the US by height, the frequency and the height. And you can see that the distributions are different. They're both quite wide, and they overlap a lot. So there are tall females and there are short males, as we know very well. It turns out that height is determined by more than 1,000 genes have an effect on height. But also there's a big environmental component because height is influenced by nutrition and disease. And it's quite possible that these might be sex-specific factors. For instance, if you feed the boys meat but the girls sweets, you'll get different height distributions. So it's even something as simple as height could be differentially expressed in males and females because of the environment. More interestingly, there's been a lot of argument about brain anatomy and brain function. Is this difference in males and females? Again, this is determined by thousands of genes and hormones, plus environmental factors, pre-birth and post-birth. And you can measure the balance of genes and the environment to particular conditions and behaviours and traits by looking at twin studies. So the difference between identical twins and non-identical twins gives you some idea of what is highly heritable, like ADHD, for instance, and what is not so heritable, like schizophrenia, for instance. And the really interesting question, of course, is there's sex differences in brain function and behaviour. And there's all sorts of studies. There's scientific studies, there's anecdotes, there's myths, and it's very hard to figure out what to believe. And I'm certainly not qualified to do that. But what I would say is it would be very surprising if there were not differences in brain function in behaviour, given that we know that there are hundreds of genes that are expressed differently in the brain of men and women. Well, you probably already know that there are a lot of very major differences in the diseases that men and women get. Firstly, in the incidence of diseases, in the age of onset, and also in the treatments. So if you look at, and this is just the top 7 categories: cardiovascular disease. Men suffer from heart attacks much more than women, but women are more susceptible to strokes. If you look at immunology, men are much more susceptible to viruses and bacteria, and so women really do have a stronger immune system. That's not all good, because women suffer from autoimmune immune diseases like multiple sclerosis. Neurology, Parkinson's disease is very frequent in men, and Alzheimer's disease in women. So again, the difference in physiology is showing up again as disease states. More than that, a number of treatments of diseases are very differently effective in males and females. So for instance, aspirin is pretty good for preventing heart attacks in men, but not so much in women. There's several cancers that are treated by different treatments in men and women. Parkinson's disease might well end up being treated in men by anti-SRY treatments. That's obviously not going to work in women, since we don't have SRY. So you can see that it's really important to know about sex in diagnosis and treatment of disease, and also in research for new treatments. And it's only very recently that this has been recognized by the National Institutes of Health, who've said, please include women in your samples for looking at the efficacy of drug, because women are not just small men. They are biologically very different. One very interesting thing is the question of, are men the weaker sex? Because we know, and we've known for a long time, that the lifespan of men is something like 6 years shorter than that of women on average. And there's been lots of speculation, well, why are men dying earlier? And it seems to be all to do with the X chromosome. There's X-linked diseases that affect mostly males, and that kills off a lot of males, particularly very early. But also, as I said before, it seems like their immune system is not as resilient as those of women. So there are very significant sex differences, and we really need to be cognizant of those. Well, why are men and women different? Well, there's very obvious reasons, and that is that any trait that's more advantageous to one sex is selected for in that sex and not the other. And we know actually quite a lot about difference of evolution in different sexes. There's a very well-known evolutionary process. And here, very simple-mindedly, if there's some sort of trait, height or weight or whatever it is, there's a fitness value. And the fitness in Darwinian sense simply means how many offspring do you have. The more offspring you have, the more your genes are going to get around. So for instance, here's a fitness, here's a trait that is equal fitness in males and females. So it's quite neutral. There's no push or shove for either sex to be bigger or smaller. But as soon as there's some sort of advantage to be gained, for instance, by males being bigger, for instance, then now you have a differential, and you can see that the optimal fitness of males is now bigger than the optimal fitness of females. So bigger males are at some sort of advantage, and it might be the bigger males get more opportunities for mating, or they might get more food. And so bigger males will have more offspring, and their bigger genes will become more frequent. So gradually over time, you'll get a shift in the female population and the male population, and they will separate. And this is exactly what's happened with, for instance, height and colour and weight and all sorts of things. And we know many, many examples in humans as well as in other mammals. So some really obvious examples are this sort of process can lead to bigger males in many animals. And so, for instance, gorillas, males are 50% bigger than gorilla females. This is quite the opposite in spiders. Female spiders are much bigger than male spiders. So it can work really in both ways, as long as there's some sort of advantage that is specific for one sex. What's really interesting is that some traits are actually good in one sex and bad in another. And the classic example is a very bright colour in birds might be an advantage for males because it's an advertisement for that male, but they're very bad for females that have to sit on a nest and nurture eggs and don't want predators to come. So again, you get a very big shift in the colour, which will become sex specific. Well, what interests me particularly is that you can actually replicate this whole process in the laboratory using the common or garden fruit fly. And what was done many, many years ago was to take a trait, just a random character that had no particular significance, funny bristles. So you see those things sticking out of the fly's back. Those bristles are very, very heritable. And if you select for funny bristles in males only, what happens very quickly is you get all the males expressing those funny bristles, but the females don't express them. Even more so, the genes around the funny bristle gene become very good for males and very bad for females. In fact, if you put that bit of the genome into a female, it dies. So this is a very good explanation of what happens when different traits have different fitnesses in males and females. Well, I should mention sexual selection because it's very, very powerful, and a lot of things that have been very rapidly selected in evolution turns out because the trait in one sex is favoured by the other sex for mating, even if it's useless or downright bad. And the classic example is the peacock. Peacock males have an absolutely magnificent tail, but it's not much good if you're trying to escape from a fox. But peahens choose peacocks with long symmetrical tails. And if you, for instance, cut feathers out of this tail, the peahen won't have anything to do with that male. So peacocks evolved longer tails, even though this impedes escape from the predators. And we call this an expensive ornament, because what the female is doing is judging the fitness of the male. He must be pretty good if he has got such a huge tail and that impedes his getting away from predators. He must be pretty good and have pretty good genes. I'll mate with him. Well, interestingly, human intelligence also might well have been a sexually selected trait. The brain size of humans increased enormously rapidly over about 50 million years, and nobody can quite understand why. And particularly strange is that a lot of the intelligence genes turn out to be on the X chromosome, and that is very heavily selected in males because they only have one, so they show that trait emerging. So human intelligence might have been boosted by women selecting smart men with smart genes on the X chromosome. The good thing is that the X chromosome, of course, is shared with women, so that boosted the intelligence of the whole species. Now, the scary thing is that surveys all over the world show that women show sexual preference for tall, dominant men. And in fact, they tend to marry men who are about 14 centimetres taller than they are. This suggests that the size difference in humans was actually driven by females choosing larger males. Presumably our ape ancestors liked bigger males because they would bring home the bacon and protect the women and the kids. But this leads us to think, well, is there any hope if women actually are preferring tall, dominant males? Are we stuck with sexual discrimination? And this is where I want to say, well, we have our genes, we're a product of evolution, but we can transcend evolution. And we do this all the time when evolution has favoured gene variants that really are not much good for us anymore. And there are lots of examples of this. For instance, our big brain makes childbirth very dangerous. But that's no problem anymore because modern medicine has reduced maternal deaths a great deal. We were evolved to have a sweet tooth, and that was very advantageous in the savannah, where it was a really good thing to recognize sweet fruit, which is much more nutritious. But now we live in a sea of sugar, and that puts us at risk of obesity and diabetes. But we can choose not to gorge on candy. We're not a prisoner of our genes or our evolution. What about our wisdom teeth? Our wisdom teeth evolved to grind hard food, but we evolved a face with expressions, and that means our jaw got smaller, and the wisdom teeth really don't fit very well and they cause problems. No worries, we can simply pull them out. And what about our metabolism? We actually lost the ability to make several vital nutrients that we call vitamins. These were things that were abundant to our ape ancestors, but no longer to us. But now we recognize we need them. We can get them in our diet. We can genetically manipulate our rice to have more of them, or we can take pills. So every day we are bucking our evolutionary past and our genetic present. So we've still got a ways to go. There are many things that our evolution has given us that are not adaptive. For instance, evolution favored a fight or flight response to escape predators. But now that's really working to our disadvantage. It's killing us with our high blood pressure, and we must control it in our everyday life. Evolution also favored groups that would exploit the environment to its absolute utmost, kill all the animals, eat all the animals, chop down all the trees. But that really doesn't work anymore, and we've got to curb our instincts to exploit the environment, or we'll risk environmental collapse and global warming. And evolution clearly favoured xenophobia. It probably was a good idea to stick to your own tribe and kill anybody who tried to come and take what was yours. However, now that's a real disadvantage, and we have to cooperate between groups and countries, otherwise we'll blow each other up. So there's lots of very, very major things that we need to do to transcend our evolution. And one of these, of course, is that evolution favoured many sex differences that were very useful for our ape ancestors, but now they're redundant. And we can now look to ways in which we can eliminate them. So what we've already done, very obviously, evolution favoured having lots of children. In fact, our ape ancestor females would have been pregnant practically the whole time, and they really couldn't do much else. Now we can control pregnancy, and we can free up women to do other things in life. Evolution made women smaller than men. But that really doesn't matter much anymore because we have modern technology, and size really is not a big deal anymore. So there are lots and lots of things that are no longer a physical barrier for women. And in fact, really the barriers to women are more cultural than biological. And that's a very good thing because we can change our culture much more easily than we can change our genes. So in conclusion, I think we really need to accept that there are big genetic differences between men and women. There are differences in the genes and particularly in the way they act. And these genes obviously translate into quite different sizes and shapes and behaviors and diseases. And we really need to recognize these differences. We also need to understand that most of the traits that we're interested in are determined by many, many genes, and the environment has a big effect. And that's where culture can have a big effect. And we need to understand that our sex-specific traits evolved by selection for sex-specific roles in our ape ancestors. But I think to move forward, we really need to stop arguing about differences. Are men and women different? Yes, they are different. In fact, it's been said that men are more similar to male chimpanzees than they are to women. And I thought that was really funny when I first heard it, but now I begin to think, well, that's not so far from the truth. There are big differences. So let's stop arguing about those differences and concentrate instead on transcending our evolutionary past and our genetic present in 1,000 different practical ways to make women more comparable to men, give women equal opportunity to men, to remove any further biological differences and cultural differences. So I think we can fight for equity and equal opportunity rather than to keep on arguing about sex differences. Thank you.